Greetings! In this video, I want to take a closer look at these acrylic marker sets from Arrtx. I have two sets. One has 30 markers with only one tip, and with mostly pastel colors. These are simple markers with a brush tip made from felt. And I also have this other set that has 24 markers, but these have two nibs. They have a fine nib and have the same brush nib that is made of felt. The two sets are acrylic marker sets, but they're really quite different, as you can see, visually especially, in the sense that the presentation is very different for each of these. I decided to swatch the markers first. This first sheet of swatches are for the 30 color set. As far as I can say, the markers themselves are not labeled with any kind of identification. You can find a chart online of the colors in the set, but each marker is not labeled. It's only identified by its color of cap and end. I swatched the pens on black and white papers to see the opacity of each color. As you can see, some colors are more opaque than others. Some colors will show a bit more white on the black paper, and they are more colorful on the white paper. So in their composition, there is some sort of transparent dye that is absorbed in the black paper, so we don't see it, but that is still visible on the white paper. This set is sold as a pastel set, and since it's quite large, not all the colors would perhaps be called pastel at first, but I feel like it's a fair way to name this assortment of colors. I also swatched the second set in the same way. I felt like this one had an odd color selection. In a way, it has a lot of muted colors, and I feel like it's missing a couple of very basic colors in there. If you combine both sets, though, you have a really nice range of colors available. So the dual tip markers are labeled. They have a color name on them, or rather a color code. So that makes it easier to link the swatches with each pen. These also vary in opacity, with some colors being much more opaque than others. To test out these markers, I did a sketch on my digital tablet, and then I printed it on printer paper and transferred it on Strathmore multimedia paper with a light table. I used both sets of marker together on this whole thing. Here's a couple of things I noticed. These are generally layerable, which means that you can put the first layer down, let it dry, and if you add another layer on top, it's gonna make the color more opaque and possibly less streaky. It really helps in making more even, flat colors. There is a bit of streakiness, especially at the first pass, and some of it is related to a feature I'll talk about a bit later, but I noticed that sometimes when I would do my first pass of color, you could really see the marker strokes, but then when I would layer, these would gradually disappear. Also, there's nothing against using that streakiness to create an effect on your drawings if you want. That's perfectly valid and can be quite cool. Since some of the colors are semi-transparent, I was able to use them layered on top of darker lines to make those dark lines lighter. So there are areas where I would draw the arm lines on my drawings and they were really dark because I couldn't find the color I wanted. But then I went back with my base color for that area and layered it on top of the lines to lighten them, and I think it worked fine. I also noticed that some colors, and I think that's mostly the black ones, they're a bit shiny. All the other markers are quite nicely matte, but the black colors that I used on my drawings, they turned out to have a tiny bit of a shine to them. And also, throughout this whole drawing, I really enjoyed using the felt tips. I ended up using the brush ones the most, and I really liked that shape. It allows you to cover wide areas if you use it more to the side, but also be quite precise if you use just the tip of it. Now, more specifically into certain colors, I noticed that there's a couple of colors that when you lay them down on the paper, they kind of feel like they separated in the pen. It makes for a sort of gradated stroke, which is not the intention, and it can be a bit disappointing if you want to lay down the color, and when you start your flat color, it's this weird messy mix of not quite the color you want. I'll try to show some close-ups to show what I mean, because it's a bit difficult to explain. What I found that helped me with this issue is to either layer many applications of the color, or to use a bit of spare paper on the side to sort of get rid of this first couple of strokes that are really more obviously separated than the ones that come after that. And then finally, something I tested out because I had my UV lamp nearby. I put these under the small UV light that I have, and I noticed that a couple of colors are reactive to the lamp. So that means for us that some of these colors have either a bit of a neon dye in them or some optical brighteners. And those particular elements are usually not very light fast. So I would expect the colors that glow up under UV light to shift color over time if they're exposed to too much sun. Okay, so the final little test that I did, because I was thinking that if these are acrylic markers, then that means that they can be used with water-based mediums like watercolor. The thing is with these two, they're both water-based, meaning that they can be diluted with water a bit, and you can basically wash your equipment with water and soap. You don't need to have a specific solvent to clean stuff up. Watercolor, which is made with gum arabic, will be reactivated with water once it's dry, whereas acrylic, which is bound together with a polymer, will dry to a plastic. So once it's dry. You can't really change it anymore unless you add more acrylic on top of it. So with that in mind, I felt like having these acrylic markers could be great to do some line work or some particular effects or touch-ups and all that when you work them alongside watercolor. So I did this page of strokes on a piece of watercolor paper and let them dry, and then I went back with 2 strokes of watercolor. Well, one stroke is just plain water and the other is a transparent watercolor. I wanted to see how the markers would react to this. Surprisingly enough, the dual-sided acrylic markers reactivated with the water, and I really did not expect that. In retrospect, it kind of makes sense because those were the colors that when I tried to layer and rework them, they would sometimes appear as if they hadn't dried in my drawings. So I thought that this came from me not letting the paint dry enough before adding a layer on top, but actually these just reactivate. And I'm not quite sure what to do with that info for now. I feel like this is perhaps not ideal considering these are acrylic markers. The other set, the 30 color set that only has one tip, these came out as completely waterproof, which is what I was expecting. So for that I was really glad. It would also explain why these colors were easier to layer and didn't give me as much streakiness or weird mixes that I was not expecting. Overall, I really like these markers. I think I might prefer the fully waterproof ones, but I think you can still use the other ones if you keep in mind that they are gonna reactivate if you layer too much. I like being able to layer with these and to build up opacity, so that's why I like the waterproof ones. And it was really interesting, even if some colors were a bit more transparent, you could always layer and layer and layer them. Like you layer, let dry, and they will build up a good opacity. I would still recommend going from light colors to dark colors in general, just because sometimes the colors are not that opaque. So you'll save yourself a lot of hassle if you work from light to dark. I like the dual-sided ones too. I would probably prefer them to be fully waterproof, but I like the 2 nibs. I felt like the fine nib was quite useful at times to delineate areas to fill. And since you have exactly the same color with the one pen that has both tips, it's quite convenient to use. Lastly, I really enjoyed the felt brush tip. We're familiar with the more bullet type nib of the Posca pens for acrylics, and these are great, but they're not very precise, whereas this felt tip can be either bold or precise with just the one tip. So I feel like that's a really interesting deal. So that's it for my first look and first impressions of these markers. Let me know what you think of these in the description below. I would love to read your thoughts, and also I'll have links to these specific sets if you want to check the listings out for more info and all of that. Again, thank you so much Arrtx for sending me these markers to try out, and also thank you guys for listening to this video, and we will see each other in the next one. Bye bye!